For those who are joining us, we are continuing our study of Father Lawrence Book's boat, reading the Old Testament. It's been a fascinating study of the Hebrew Scriptures, of the Old Testament. For those who are joining us on Facebook, there is a link down below where you can access the chapter that we're studying this evening, which focuses on the books of Samuel and the books of Kings. We know that there is a first and a second book of Samuel and a first and a second book of Kings. How much do we know about those books? Ready to jump in? Page 194, the first and second books of Samuel talk about the last days of the period of the Judges and the first days of Israel as a monarchy. Remember last lesson? We were talking about the book of Judges. Who were the judges? We said that a better word for judges might have been the warriors, right? Various warriors, tribal chiefs who at that time were the ones who stepped up and led us into battle, but also who decided various matters, which is why we also refer to them as judges. So there's going to be a transition from that time of us having tribal warlords or warriors to a time of us having a monarch with the death of Duke Philip. We're talking about monarchs a bit more these days. Back then, we were looking at other nations and seeing how they had kings, I would say kings and queens, but it was a very androcentric or male-centered world at that time. We saw how they had kings who led them into battle, and we started thinking, wouldn't that be cool if we had a king who led us into battle? There was a tension, of course, because some of us in the room said, we don't need a king, God is our king. And others said, yeah, but we still need someone in this room leading us into battle. In the books of Samuel, then Samuel 1 and Samuel 2, we have the story of the transition from the last judge to Saul, who is the first king. So a bit of Bible trivia. Who is the first king in the Bible? Saul. It goes Saul, and then David, and then Solomon. So David and Solomon are probably the ones that we hear of more. Saul is the one we hear of least. When we hear of Saul, we probably also think of another person by that same name. Can you think of someone else who was named Saul in the Bible?
Paul.
Paul. Before Paul was Paul, Paul's name was Saul. Let's see. The most desperate moments of danger Israel had ever faced, following, and then the reign of David and Solomon was sort of like the highest success. So kings proved to be a mixed blessing for us. They provided a strong government, but also it meant that we as tribes had to give something up. Remember, in terms of the history, there were all these tribes. It was the kings who brought us all together. But in order to come together, that meant that we had to give up some of who we were and some of our identity in order to be part of the kingdom. Page 195 speaks of the life of Samuel. The first and second books of Samuel transition from the loose tribal league in force since the time of Joshua to the strong centralized state forged by David and Solomon. So we're understanding before we start ourselves more as tribes. And we often use, remember the etiology of it was we used to explain that, we actually have more in common than that which separates us because we descended from the same family. That was the story that we told. Now we're going to go from just being loose tribes, saying that we're related, to actually being part of the same kingdom. 1 Samuel in the 11th century BC opens at the Shrine of Shiloh. You've heard this story before. Eli, the priest, is guarding the Ark of the Covenant. Have we heard the name Eli before? We're talking about the story of Samuel. Samuel's going to get a call from God. God is going to call him, Samuel, Samuel. Samuel's going to run to Eli. You called me? No, I didn't call you. Go back to sleep. We've all heard that story. In the end, Eli says, go back to sleep. If you hear someone call you again, say, here I am, Lord. I come to do your will. That's the story of Samuel. Samuel then was in the Shrine of Shiloh, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. We all remember what the Ark of the Covenant was. That was the wooden box made out of acacia wood, which was believed to be incorruptible, which held certain artifacts that we carried with us on our journey through the wilderness, including the stone tablets with the 10 Commandments, including some manna, including Aaron's staff, etc. Samuel's mother, we don't hear often about her, but she's an important figure because Samuel's mother, on page 195, Her name was Hannah. Why is Hannah significant? Because like many other stories that were told back then, Hannah was barren, but God, who can do all things, took this barren woman and made her the mother of Samuel. Hannah. She dedicated, so as a result, she gave birth to a child, dedicated her child to serve at the shrine under Eli. Samuel received a special call from God. Here I am, Lord. Samuel became a priest and a seer. What's a seer? It was believed that a seer could see into the future. Yikes. Eli allows the tribes to take the ark into battle against the overwhelming Philistine forces. Do you remember the Philistines from last lesson? Philistines, this was the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age. Philistines had iron, Israelites did not. They were still using bronze weapons. It was not a good idea, but they said, we have the Ark of the Covenant, God is on our side, we're going to march into battle, and God is going to be on our side. What happened? They got their back ends kicked. Against the overwhelming Philistine forces, the Philistines destroy Israel's forces, capture the ark, they kill Eli's sons, and that defeat led to Eli's own sudden death on hearing the news. And after Eli's death, then that clears the way for Samuel to be the preeminent religious force in the country after that. The danger from the Philistines was so great that the tribes themselves realized that they would not have a chance under their forces unless their forces were united. So there's a realistic, we all looked around the room and said, you know, the Philistines are going to beat us one by one unless we come together. The people begged Samuel to give them a king. Remember, Samuel was a priest and a seer. It's going to be Samuel who anoints the kings. Samuel warned them of the danger of giving so much power to one person, right? Anytime you have a monarch, that person could become a tyrant. So there was a mixed reaction to the decision to have a king. And so we see in the book of Samuel two different traditions. Remember, we talk about the editors of this work. We often use the example of Stephen and Jordan, the priestly class who had to edit the work. They were putting together two different traditions. One tradition was positive toward kingship. Oh, David was the greatest thing that ever happened to us. Another tradition that they pulled together into the same book on page 196 was a view of the kingship with suspicion and regarding the king as sinful. We betrayed God and God's kingship by turning to another king. We didn't trust in God. Do you see those two conflicting views? So on the one hand, we're going to see David is great, and how great that we have a king. On the other hand, we betrayed God, and that's why we have a king. So there's going to be a positive spin and a negative spin. These editors of this work have the challenge of bringing those both together in the same book. You can see on page 196 various pro-kingship sources, various anti-kingship sources, how it was that they came together into one. Some of the pro sources: Saul becomes the king with the blessing and secret anointing of Samuel. Saul proves to be a great military leader. Those are people who like the idea of having a king. Those who don't like having the idea of a king talk about how it was that the people wanted a king against Samuel's wish. Samuel told the people that they rejected God, but Samuel, in the end, talks about the dangers of them having a king, but in the end, anoints a king for them. You asked for it, you got it. The story of Saul. Ready for the story of the first king? Again, this is the first book of Kings that we find the story of the first king, Saul. Saul proves himself to be a valiant warrior, never manages to gain the final victory to unite Israel, so it's going to be the next king, David, who unites the tribes into a kingdom. So when I refer to the united kingdom, it's David and his son Solomon who are going to rule over the united kingdom, and that is seen by the Israelites as the glory of Israel. When we were all united and under the same king, for David and then for Solomon, those were the glory days. Unfortunately, Saul was moody, had a rash temperament, lacked organizational ability, turned against Samuel through his own arrogance, and almost executed his own son Jonathan. Just just want to pause there briefly because Jonathan and David are often viewed as patron saints within the LGBTQ community because there are various stories that are told of King Saul's son Jonathan and King Saul's armor bearer David, who, when Saul would shoot his arrows, would go out for target practice, he'd shoot his arrows, and then Jonathan would go to run and pick up the arrows, and David would be hiding in the bushes, waiting for Jonathan to pick up the arrows so that they could do whatever they did in the bushes while he was picking up the arrows. So, for that reason, they're often seen as patron saints of the LGBTQ community, Jonathan and David. Fascinating work. Read the book of the first book of Samuel. David is the young aide of Saul, who is his armor bearer and musician. Had a winning personality, great skill as a warrior. He is known for killing the Philistine hero Goliath. David and Goliath, we've heard that story. Goliath had armor and iron weapons. David, shepherd boy with a slingshot and a stone. And according to Grandpa Rudy's story, killed him with that stone.
Right on the ice.
So as a result, David was a sort of local hero. The first book of Samuel, chapter 18, says, Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. You can imagine King Saul getting a little jealous now of his armor bearer, who's getting more songs written about him than about the king. The second half of the book of 1 Samuel traces David's rise to power. What happens in that book? Samuel transfers Saul's blessing to David. So this creates a problem. Samuel anointed Saul. Now Samuel decides, well, we're no longer going to support Saul. I'm going to anoint another king. He anoints David. That creates a problem. Two kings cannot exist in the same place at the same time. So David goes and flees. You see on page 197? In the end, Saul is killed in a great battle on Mount Gilboa. Both Saul and his son Jonathan, David's love, is killed. And in fact, there's a great poem of David lamenting the death of Jonathan. We're going to pause there, see if there are any questions or comments on Samuel or Saul before we get into David. Page 197, David's rise to power then. The book that's known as the second book of Samuel now begins to talk about David as king. First book of Samuel talks about Samuel and Saul. Second book of Samuel talks about David. Let's see. There's a breakdown on page 197 of the various chapters. Childhood and prophetic call of Samuel, chapters 1 to 3, chapters 4 to 6, the Ark of the Covenant in battle, the battle that they lost. Chapters 7 to 12, Samuel and Israel's decision to have a king. First, Samuel ends with the story of Saul's failure and David's rise to power, and then 2 Samuel is about David and his successors, his sons. David, page 197 at the bottom, defeated the Philistines, extended the borders of Israel from the river of Egypt, the Nile, to the Euphrates. So now imagine from one river to the other river, we have a united kingdom. All these tribes have come together under one king, and that king is David. Page 198, among David's victories, the things that he accomplished, one was he conquered the Canaanite city of Jerusalem. Have you heard that name before? Jerusalem, of course. So once he conquered that city, he made that city his capital, and that would later be the city where the temple was built in honor of his God. In the Psalms, we see also in the second book of Samuel, but also in the Psalms, there are various Psalms about taking the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. There was a big celebration after they had conquered Jerusalem. They were taking the Ark of the Covenant into what was going to be David's new capital, and they had a big celebration to be able to honor David, the king, coming into his new city, his new capital. David would not construct the temple during his life. It was Solomon who would begin that project. Page 198 at the bottom, the special promise to David, remembered in the Psalms and the worship of Judah, was based on God's special relationship with them. Let's see if we can diagram it here. Our God, Yahweh, is the God of David, our king, who is our king. So it's sort of like that is, David was sort of the way that we talked about God blessing us. God blessed us through King David. God allowed David to conquer Jerusalem, our capital city. God allowed David to clear the way for the building of the temple by his son Solomon. So God was working in our history through King David in a way that we didn't see with Saul. We didn't say, oh, God is working through Saul for us. We just didn't see it that way. Saul is portrayed as a more rash king who is more of a tyrant and a crazy man than the good David, who is portrayed as a hero. So every time we tell stories of David, it's essentially telling stories about God. How God was on our side fighting with David in the victory in various battles. Oh, page 199. Are you sitting down for the dark side of David? So now that we have the editors of this work, the priestly class, trying to bring together different traditions, one side says, oh, kings are so great and King David was so great. The other is going to be the darker side, which is that side that acknowledges that we had a king and that king was God. And so let me tell you a few stories about David's dark side. Page 199. David is portrayed as being scheming and calculating, rose to power as a warlord through dishonest means, played Saul off against the Philistines, bought loyalties in the south, made a personal army loyal to him, exploited the deaths of Saul and Jonathan to become king himself in place of their rightful heir. We all know how it is with kings, right? When the king dies, who becomes the next king? The king's oldest son. So there's a bit of scheming here where the king's next in line for succession didn't become the king because his other warlord, David, threw himself into the situation. Charges against him. He sought to advance himself at Saul's expense. He was an outlaw and a Philistine mercenary. He was implicated in the deaths of various persons, including Saul, Abner, and Ishbaal. First full paragraph on page 199. There are a few dark facts that we just can't apologize for. It's really hard to excuse David for a few things, including the fact that he had an adulterous relationship with a woman named Bathsheba. Have you heard of her? Well, the thing was that Bathsheba was married to another man, Uriah, and so in order to take Bathsheba as his own, David had to get rid of Uriah, so David took care of business. The story that's told is that he sent out Uriah as the captain and said, you'll be on the front lines of the army going into battle? Yes, sir. Uriah was killed. And David had Bathsheba to himself.
He started the draft.
He started the draft. Yeah, let's come back to that actually, because that's going to be one of the causes. When we're talking about the dark side of David and of Solomon, the way that they drafted people was not always welcomed by folks. They weren't necessarily saying, we want to fight on your side. Which leads us to the next point. The revolts by his own son. There's a dynamic going on here when your old sons are revolting against you, and those who glorified David don't talk about how his sons revolted against him. Part of the darker side of David is acknowledging that and the support that they had of people who were unhappy with things like forced labor gangs. That fits with Mario's notion of us being drafted. We were drafted into more than just the army. We were forced to build the various projects that they were building. Building city walls, restoring the capital.
Took a census first.
There you go.
And then
There's a good thing about that. Once you have a sense of all the men of a certain age, you know who's eligible for the military and who's eligible for labor gangs. So, as you can imagine, those who are painting the darker picture of David are going to be pointing out those elements of the monarchy that people don't necessarily like. Middle of page 199, the terrible sin committed by David, of course, was the murder of Uriah. The prophet Nathan confronted him. David repented and did penance. See, the challenge was that even though he was a bad person in the view of some, David was the person through whom God was acting on our behalf. So it's kind of hard for us to, when you have a king who's on your side, you tend to paint the king in heroic terms rather than pointing out all the king's flaws. Bottom of page 199, another family story that fits under the dark side of David and his family. David's son Amnon, follow me now, raped Amnon's half-sister Tamar. So they're half-brother, half-sister, meaning they share their father in common but have different mothers. The brother rapes the sister. In turn, Tamar's brother Absalom kills Amnon. Absalom is spared by David, only to later plot against David. So we're getting a very human view of family drama. Right? Tamar, interestingly, is going to be mentioned in Jesus's genealogy, that Jesus descended from those lines. There are only 4 women who are mentioned in Jesus' genealogy, and all 4 of them have something that's irregular about them. What's irregular about Tamar? That she is famous for being raped by her brother. So Matthew and Luke, in giving these genealogies of Jesus, by mentioning Tamar, Luke, by mentioning these 4 women, is showing how Mary's irregular situation fits within the story of other women who were in irregular situations, including Tamar, who was raped by her brother. In David's old age, another son, Adonijah, tried to overthrow him from the throne. Nathan and Zadok the priest rushed Solomon to be crowned before the other son could seize power. Nathan and Zadok, we saw the name Nathan. Nathan was a prophet. Zadok, do you remember seeing that name before? We just saw that 2 weeks ago. Zadok, the Sadducees were named after King David's high priest. His name was Zadok. Page 201. So, even though David was far from perfect, God was showing God's faithfulness to us by acting through David. And then David, so the kings, we go from Saul, whom we don't acknowledge as being God's instrument in the same way, to David, whom we do acknowledge as being God's anointed, then to David's son Solomon, and we're going to have the same relationship with Solomon too, that Solomon was anointed by God to serve us. One of the ways that we confirm that is that Solomon is going to be the one who builds the temple in Jerusalem. And so obviously if Solomon is building a temple to our God, then that shows how God is working through Solomon for us. If only it were that easy. Page 201, we'll stick with David for just another moment. David appears as a symbol of God's love for Israel. God blessed us through David. You see there are 2 Psalms, Psalm 89 and Psalm 110, also Psalm 2, talking about God, showing God's love to us through David. My steadfast love I will show you forever. My covenant will stand firm for him. I will establish his descendants forever. Who is he talking about? David. What we're going to see is that David's descendants, we're going to see them on the throne for 400 years, but then we're going to be deported. And after we're deported, then we no longer have a kingdom, which is why we start dreaming one day about having our own kingdom again. And if we're going to have a kingdom again, then we need someone who's going to be the ruler of that new kingdom. And so who are we going to see as the ruler of that kingdom? We're going to refer to him as the son of David. And who for early Christians was the son of David who was going to restore the kingdom? Jesus. We longed for a Messiah, a person who would free us from the Romans, from the Roman Empire, and who would bring back David's rule, David's kingdom. We were looking for the son of David. So in Mark's gospel, it's important when they start referring to Jesus as the son of David, people are looking at him and saying, oh, this is the one. He's going to restore us to these glory days when God was working for us through David and Solomon. David and Solomon ruled over what I like to refer to as the United Kingdom. David brought together all of the tribes into one kingdom. Solomon continued his reign. By the time of Solomon's death, the kingdom falls apart. All that to say, the kingdom didn't last very long. But we see them as the glory days for us. Page 201, at the bottom of page 201. How did David receive such high praise in the Old Testament when he had so many dubious qualities about him? The key to this was David's blessing from God and David's complete loyalty to God despite his foibles. God had protected David, and that lasted for 400 years until Judah and Jerusalem fell in the hands of the Babylonians in 586. Their kingdom would continue until 586, 400 years. David is famous today because of establishing the sanctuary for the worship of Yahweh, of God, at Jerusalem. So he made Jerusalem the capital. They brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, and they established that as the center of the kingdom. He's also known as the composer of the Psalms. So the book of Psalms, many of those Psalms are attributed to David. Does that mean that David wrote them? We don't know. I wasn't living then. What I do know is that the people whoever wrote it, put David's name on it. So if David wrote it, he signed his name to it. If someone else wrote it, he attributed it to the king. I'm imagining that if I were the king, I'd have other people writing songs in my name. Right? I'm imagining that I could sit down and write the songs myself, or I could say, hey, could you write a song for me? We're going to perform it at dinner tonight. Page 202, God used the gifted, though flawed king to accomplish God's divine purpose. Now where it becomes fascinating on page 202 is when you start to see parallels between David and Jesus. We say that Jesus is the son of David. Okay, prove it. Show me how Jesus was the son of David. What did Jesus do that resembled David? Did they have anything in common? Actually, they did. David went into Kidron Valley. Oh, let's tell the story of Jesus going into the Kidron Valley. David went into the Mount of Olives. Oh, tell the story of Jesus going into the Mount of Olives. Follow me? David bore the curse of the people. David had a betrayer who hanged himself. David returned in glory to Jerusalem. What did Jesus do? Was betrayed, had the people rise up against him, returned to Jerusalem in glory. Jesus was the son of David. Questions or comments on David before we get to his son Solomon? This sort of quick study here. Solomon, page 202. So fortunately, David united the kingdom, so Saul was able to inherit what David built. Saul had a rule that was already firmly established. He was able to easily put to death his most powerful and dangerous rivals, people like Adonijah, Joab, Shimei. He exiled Abiathar. He made a treaty with King Hiram of Tyre. He married the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt. Let's just pause and think of the significance of this. If you want to be successful and not get any wars with Egypt, probably a good way is to come into an alliance with Egypt where you, Solomon, are marrying the Pharaoh's daughter, and then the Pharaoh will be he'll be less likely to be attacking you. He's not going to attack his daughter's kingdom. Solomon comes down to us in history as a smart guy. Marrying the Pharaoh's daughter was a smart move. Top of page 203, having married an Egyptian, he organized this new empire of Israel along the lines of administration used in Egypt. Think of the ties here, because when the priestly class is editing together our works, they're going to be telling stories based on what it was. How interesting that this guy had a wife who came from Egypt, because we're going to find ourselves telling stories about various other ties to Egypt. The things that we're doing in this kingdom that tie to Egypt trace even farther back from Solomon to the time when we used to be in Egypt. So in many ways, Solomon was imitating the ways of foreign powers, borrowing what they were doing. Two outstanding achievements on page 203. One, his wisdom. Two, the temple. We talk about his wisdom first. Have you heard of stories of Solomon's wisdom? In fact, the book of Proverbs is attributed to Solomon. The story is told that God came to Solomon. Have you heard the story before? God came to Solomon and said, Solomon, I'll give you anything you ask for. Anything you ask for, I'll give it to you. What did Solomon ask for? Wisdom and understanding. Another famous story, the second full paragraph on page 203. Two women came to Solomon, arguing over a baby. This baby is mine. No, it's mine. No, it's mine. No, it's mine. What do you do if you're the king and you have to decide the case of the baby in a time when there's no DNA testing? DNA testing, you just send out the DNA in and get it tested. Back then, what was his solution?
Split them in two.
Cut the baby in half. Cut the baby in half and give a half to each person who claims the baby belongs to him. At which point, one woman said, no, give the baby to her. And Saul said, okay, that's the mother. Ever heard that story before? The wisdom of Solomon. Ooh, that was smart. His wisdom was affirmed in Proverbs and Songs. He was said to have knowledge of all plants and animals. That's in 1 Kings chapter 4. His other major accomplishment, the temple. He constructed the walls around the city of Jerusalem. He created an enormous palace for himself, including a temple on the hill called Zion. If you've heard of Mount Zion, you might just go up to the temple of the Lord on Mount Zion. He built it for 20 years with forced labor gangs from throughout the kingdom. Yay, it's my turn to be part of a forced labor gang and go to build the temple. Fortunately, he inherited the kingdom from his father. He lived during a peaceful time. So, the challenges for Solomon fortunately lived during it was a good time to be a king. Page 204. A lot of the reason that we praise Solomon today, frankly, if we're to be honest, is because he built the temple to our God. God worked through Solomon, allowing us to build the temple to our God. What did that mean for us concretely? We were understanding that God was blessing us through Solomon, even allowing us to have a temple to our God through Solomon. Solomon helped us to build a temple to our God. There's going to be a problem with this in just a moment, because Solomon's going to build other temples to other gods as well. That's part of the dark story. But for us, the good news was Solomon built a temple for us to worship our God. God worked through Solomon to build us a temple.
And this is the temple that only has the wailing wall?
That is the temple.
Okay.
The temple that Solomon built. Actually, almost, I don't want to answer correctly. Solomon is going to build a temple, which is later going to be destroyed when we're exiled. And then we're going to rebuild it in the century before Jesus. Hi, page 204. Evaluating Solomon's reign. We go to the dark story of Solomon too. Solomon was human too. We love Grandpa Rudy's stories and the way that he idolizes people. King David was so great and King Solomon was so great. We love those, but as adults now, as kids we love those stories. As adults, we recognize that Solomon and David were both human beings like the rest of us. Part of Solomon's dark side, page 204, he was a tyrant who outdid even the pagan kings in the luxury of his lifestyle, had 1,000 wives and concubines. Who do I want to sleep with this evening?
Oh my gosh.
1,000 wives and concubines, let that sink in. And so, think about that. When you have 1,000 wives and concubines, what does that mean? Obviously, you've gotten those wives and concubines from all over the place. They have all sorts of gods. You sleep with one night, and she says, oh, honey, you wake up in the next morning and you're smoking a cigarette. She says, honey, will you build me a temple to my God? And you say, yes, my love. And then the next night you're in bed with another woman from another country who says, whereas you're smoking your cigarette in the morning, says, honey, will you build me a temple to my God? And he says, yes, my love. So we have this strange dynamic of him intermarrying with all sorts of other foreign peoples, building temples to all those gods. And what we're seeing in the Bible is the bright side of the story. We're saying, well, yes, he did all those things, but the good news is that he allowed us to build a temple to our God. You can imagine the vast amount of supplies it takes to feed and support 1,000 wives and concubines and their children, so he had to tax the citizens as a result of that. So obviously that's going to lead to some ill will. He laid down new boundaries for provinces that split our tribes. So just imagine when you're dividing your kingdom into various provinces now, instead of honoring our tribes, cutting our tribes in half, certainly ruffled our feathers. He encouraged religious practices that opposed worship of our God, Yahweh. He encouraged, yes, he did these great things for us, allowing us to build our temple. But let's just acknowledge as well, now that you kids are in high school, let me tell you another part of the story, that he also encouraged the worship of other gods. Which doesn't fit with our religion. In our religion, we say that our God is the only God. Thou shalt not have no other gods. We just want to acknowledge that this king had his flaws, and one of those flaws was that he did encourage worship of other gods. So he adopted many pagan practices of ritual and decorations for the temple. That may be the most scandalous one. For us to see some of the things happening in our temples, like the altars with the horns on the altars, that wasn't Jewish. He was introducing various pagan elements into our temple, but at least he gave us a temple. What are we going to do? Are we going to complain? Or are we just going to say, thank you, my Lord? We'll worship at the altar that you built.
So he started the taxes.
He started taxes.
Tax the
Aren't you glad you have a king now?
Somebody got to pay for
And
it.
someone's got to pay for it. Page 206, we'll end with the story of King Solomon. Trouble broke out everywhere by the end of Solomon's rule, and that's why the kingdom was only united under David and Solomon, because by the end of his rule, there were problems breaking out. The Edomites rebelled and broke free. The Syrians won their freedom. Israelites were fed up with the forced labor and were revolting under the head of the labor gangs, Jeroboam. And so the picture that's painted of Solomon by people who are more sober in their look at this. There's Grandpa Rudy telling his stories of King Solomon, and we love Grandpa Rudy's stories. For another version of the story, it's that Solomon died out of touch with his own people. It says on page 206, he'd become a total master of the people's lives, like the kings of other nations in every bad sense, just as Samuel had warned 80 years ago. Samuel warned the people, you don't want a king. Believe me, you don't want a king. You want a king? Okay, I'll give you a king. Gave you one king, he ended up pretty bad. David had some pretty dark sides too. Solomon, yes, we will paint him as wise and as building the temple in Grandpa Rudy's stories, but there was a bad side to that too, and by the end of his kingship, of his rule, we were essentially beginning to regret our decision to have a king.
He started worshiping idols, right?
So Solomon was finding a way to accommodate the gods of many peoples.
Yeah.
I guess that's what happens when you have 1,000 wives and concubines.
Yeah.
Honey, will you build a temple to my God too?
Pray to 1,000 idols.
So that's a complex picture of David and Solomon. I regret that I'm the one who has to be cracking open Father Lawrence Boat's book and exposing this, but it's probably just as good for us as more mature Catholics to be learning these things, that what the Bible contains is a rich, rich story, if only we were to read it. Page 206, we conclude this chapter with a description of kingship among our neighbors. Let's just be honest. The idea that we had of having a king was not an original idea. We stole it from other people. Hey, look over there. They have a king. We should have a king. Mario, you want to be the king? We should have a king.
Sure.
It was normal for their monarchies were normal in that part of the world at that time, where we had a ruler who passed the kingdom on to his oldest son, who passed the kingdom on to his oldest son. That was just the way that monarchies were beginning to work in that part of the world. In theory, the king's power was absolute, but in practice, we know that the people limit the power of the monarch. Page 207. One common feature was the king's duty was to restore the harmony of the universe. The king was to keep peace in the universe and in the kingdom, which is why we looked to the king to judge certain situations. Okay, two women are fighting over the baby. What are we going to do? Take it to the king. Let the king decide. It's the king's job to have justice and balance in the world. The king led the army into battle, which of course didn't need to take place. He inherited a peaceful kingdom himself. But in other places, David and Saul were leading the army. The king played a role in rituals and in religion, which is why many of the Psalms talk about the king and the king's place in religion. Page 208, the real tension though was, again, we had another faction saying, why do we need a king? People, we don't need a king. God is our king. We don't need a human king. That theology on page 208 is expressed in the book of Exodus. God is our king. Many of the Psalms talk about God being the king, ruler of the world. So we had this theology that God is the king. We serve God. We are God's people. Psalms 93, 95, 96, 97, 98 talk about God as king, or God as ruler. So the king became for us, once we did start crowning kings then, the king became for us a symbol then, out on page 208, of blessing. God has blessed us through the king. Whether that's David, whether that's Solomon, God is blessing us through that person. That king is the son of God. So one of the things that made us different in Israel is that our kings didn't claim to be God, as was happening, say, in Egypt or in other places. Right? In Egypt, the Pharaoh was God. No, in these places, we acknowledge that these people were human beings like us, had their own frailties as well, but God was somehow working through them to help us. God was on our side helping us through the king. God worked through Solomon, allowing us to have a temple to worship our God through Solomon. Yes, Solomon created other temples to other gods. Yes, Solomon worshipped other gods, but that's part of the story that we don't share with the kids. The story that we share with the kids is how God worked through King Solomon to help us.
And you would have thought that God would have punished him or something for doing that and building temples for other different gods besides him. Maybe that's why I gave him 1,000 wives and concubines.
Yeah, maybe that's where we have to wait for Grandpa Rudy to come back too and tell us the story. Right? Did the kingdom fall apart at the end because of Solomon's unfaithfulness? Ooh.
Stay tuned next week.
Yeah. Did the way that Solomon died go back to his turning away from God? I don't know. Let's get Grandpa Rudy a drink and sit down around the fire and see what he starts to tell us. Following? And part of it depends on whether the kids are still awake. So long as the kids are still awake, then the stories that we're telling is God working through the king for us. God working through King Solomon to give us a temple to worship our God. That's the story that we're telling the kids.
So Solomon was David's son, but David wasn't Saul's son.
Correct.
Saul was just the first king.
Saul was just the first king.
That they got.
That's right.
Okay.
And then after Saul and his son Jonathan, because otherwise the throne would have been passed, it would have Saul's family. But instead, another warlord came, whom we know as David, who took over.
Isn't that the story that you told us where David had the opportunity to kill Saul because Saul had gone into a cave to use the bathroom or something?
Actually, I think it's the story that I'm familiar with is Saul was sleeping.
Oh.
So imagine for a moment Saul is sleeping in his tent with all of his soldiers, and David sneaks in and is thinking, I could drive my spear into his head right now, but instead I'm just going to mess with him. Of course, I mean, let's read the Bible. Let's listen to Grandpa Rudy's stories of this because they're fascinating stories. And part of it is figuring out, there's no source outside of the Bible that talks about these. So what of it is true and based on what the actual person did versus separating out the story? Because that's a great story. I just have a feeling though that if I sneak into my enemy's tent, I'm going to do more than just mess with him. If you have a spear in your hand and your enemy is there.
Yeah. Okay, I get it.
It took so long to get rid of kings, Like France started the revolution, the U.S., 1700.
Sociologists would talk often about the power dynamics, power distance. Here in the United States, Geert Hofstede says that different cultures are different in 5 key aspects, and one of those is power distance. Here in the United States, we don't have a lot of power distance. We tend to believe this is Father Jamie and this is me. Father Jamie isn't above me. Other cultures have more power distance. Don't get me wrong. In the Catholic Church, we have a bit of power distance, right? Here's the Pope, and here's the cardinals, and here's the bishops. There's a power distance in the Catholic culture in the Catholic Church. But as Americans, we tend not to have power distance in the same way, which is why monarchy just doesn't fit with our values. We are equals. The Spanish culture, usted, to have an usted form in your language means this is you, usted, and this is me. Ooh, that's power distance. So it's interesting, as Mario points out, in the last 300 years, 200 years, 250 years, there's been a movement away from monarchies and toward democracies. It's an experiment. Democracies are an experiment. Sometimes they seem to work in some places.
The French Revolution. But it's hard to rule a country. It's very difficult, whether you have a democracy, but it could be also corrupted. There's countries that claim they have democracy, but the people with power are going to rule.
Okay. Politics is all about ruling over the police, the people. And so in order to rule over the people, you got to keep the people happy. You don't want people rising up against you. It doesn't turn out well. Ask Marie Antoinette.
That's why some people go to dictatorship. They kind of give up and say, all right,
Give us a king.
we're going to give it to you and
Please
hope
don't
you do
mistreat us.
something well.
Concluding comments, Joe?
I'll mess up the divine right of kings.
Uh-huh.
We reach a point 200 or 300 years later where people say it was okay to get your head chopped off because the king said it was done.
I don't know if there's a question there. Let's just back up. For those who are hearing this,
How did they reach that point?
the divine right of kings was this person telling the people, I mean, if we have a king, we believe that God is blessing us through the king, but then when the king or queen starts to do something, we're starting to scratch our heads and wonder, this person starts to tell stories about how it was that God put this person into that position? Or even worse, people within the church start to tell these stories. You get the Pope or bishops saying, God put this king over to rule over us. And the church, in the Middle Ages, the church was famous for getting involved in politics and supporting various persons in power, and suggesting that there was a divine right, that God was putting different people in power, but that I, as Pope, will be the one to crown you. You owe me, buddy. That gets into some murky waters when you're talking about human beings who are as sinful as the rest.
I should be king.
You should be king. Be a good king.
For a while.
Don't be a tyrant.
Only for a while.
Any last questions or comments on the books of Samuel and the books of Kings, talking about Samuel and Saul and David and Solomon? Enough for one night?
So now
So you said the first, I'm sorry, Mario, go ahead.
excuse me?
Were you speaking? I'm sorry. No, you weren't speaking. You weren't talking to Father while I interrupted.
Go ahead, Becky, and then we'll come to Mario. Becky?
Okay, you said the first book of Samuel was about Samuel and Saul, and the second book of Samuel was about David and his sons. Okay, first book of Kings and second book of Kings, or can you kind of give a little thing, a little synopsis of that?
Of course,
first?
in fact, I think that it's outlined for us. Let's see if there's, do we have it in here? Oh, Father Larry Poe doesn't give us a very good summary of that, does he?
Oh, that's okay. That's okay.
I think if we were to explore it, I think you would see a lot of it, as we see on page 200, 1 Kings, speaking of David's fidelity to God, to Yahweh was the term that we used back then. Here you see how it is through both the book of Kings. We have lots of stories of David.
Okay.
All that to say, if you're feeling bored and looking for a good story about Samuel and or Saul and or David and or Solomon, the books of Samuel and the books of Kings. Mario?
Was Solomon the one that these 2 women were claiming a baby?
Up,
And she said, well, let's cut him,
up, with Solomon's wisdom.
let's cut the baby
Cut him in half.
in half. And the mother was the one that, oh, no,
That's right.
I'd rather give it to
That's
her.
right. That's right.
So she was the real mother.
That's right. That's how Saul knew. Saul is known as a wise guy, as a wisdom figure, as one with wisdom, and for building the temple.
Building a temple.
A temple for our God. God used Solomon to build us a temple for our God. Yes, you build other temples to other gods as well and worship other gods, but that's not the story we're going to share with the kids tonight.
I wonder, when I went to Guatemala and saw all those pyramids and all that, and they believe in a God, but how could somebody would tell them? Somehow they built temples to God, and they did sacrifices, just like, where did they get all that communication? And one of the guides was real sharp. I mean, this lady asked him, did somebody from here go to Europe or to the Middle East and got the idea? And he turned around and said, no, we probably gave them the idea. The natives said, we believe in something.
There's a human dynamic. Anthropologists are the one who study this. How did ancient cultures come up with all of these things? And we recognize that here in the United States or in the Americas, we came from another continent, so we probably brought a lot of these things over the Bering Strait with us, but there's something about this dynamic of various ancient cultures having rulers and having a priestly class, and how those two often worked together to create harmony in the kingdom. Father Jamie, we will allow you to be part of the priestly class in this kingdom so long as you're working with the king and not against the king. the king.
Some people say whoever writes it down are the winners. You know, it's just like families. Some people just don't write anything down. And
Stories get lost.
I've been appointed in my family to do the writing for
There you go.
our people. And now my nephews are picking up.
The reason we have our religion is because we wrote it down. The Akkadians did not. The Syrians did not. So many other cultures did not. We wrote down our stories. We wrote down Grandpa Rudy's stories. We had a priestly class that edited those stories, brought them together into a book. So now we have what we have today. Enough for one night? Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now,
and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
Just want to encourage, I know some of us in this room have a copy of this already, Father Lawrence's book. If so, you can be reading ahead. Next week, we're going to be talking about the daily life in ancient Israel. So.
Where did they buy them? Where did they get them?
Amazon or anywhere online? Can we just?
No,